We're at the New York State Museum. This is our gallery that's dedicated to the history of September 11th and the attacks in New York at the World Trade Center. The New York State Museum has the nation's largest collection of material amassed after the attacks of September 11th. We decided with a gallery to tell the story for the first moments of the attacks using objects and photographs from the World Trade Center site. This is a piece of steel from the South Tower, the World Trade Center, floors 7 through 9. We put it in a place where the public can actually come and touch it. It gives the visitor a real tangible experience. You can see where the windows were in the steel. This would have been the outside of the building clad with aluminum. When we designed the galleries, we very purposefully put a major artifact to confront the visitor that wasn't something that was frightening or twisted. We thought a powerful piece of structural steel would be the first things people would see to start to begin to understand the scale of the World Trade Center and of the attacks. About 100 rescue vehicles were destroyed on September 11th in New York. And we were going to Fresh Kills and looking at the vehicles. We researched them and decided to collect this complete vehicle. So this is Engine 6, dedicated to service any emergency at the towers. This truck was one of the first responders. It came a few blocks from Beekman Street and pulled up right next to the North Tower, where they hooked up to the standpipe to start pumping water up into the systems in the North Tower. As it arrived, the South Tower was hit. The South Tower fell. At that time, the 4 men who were up, the 5 men inside the tower began to evacuate. 4 of the men were killed, and 1 of them lived. The driver of the truck ran up West Street with the cloud of the North Tower behind him and lived as well. This is an armrest and seat belt from one of the 2 planes that struck the towers in New York City. We don't know which plane it's from. We don't know which seat it's from because the 2 planes were similar enough that you wouldn't be able to tell. We talked to a number of family members before it went on exhibit because we wanted to make sure that people weren't upset, that it was an appropriate thing to do, and resoundingly, family members, meaning a mother or a father or a wife or a husband who had lost somebody, said, yes, this would be a good thing to put out, particularly the people on the planes, because so little was found of in their remains. But it's a powerful beginning, we think, to the exhibition. You know, we start telling this story at 6:30 a.m., and when we were collecting material, some of the things we collected were everyday objects that took on tremendous historical meaning. There's a New York Post from that morning that was found in a car at the site. Early on, we saw glass everywhere. At the World Trade Center site, at the Fresh Kills recovery operation, it was just everywhere. This is the largest piece of glass. It's about 10 inches in size. And it was found at the recovery operation at Fresh Kills, and they were very excited, and they saved it for us on a day we weren't there when we came back. There were 43,000 panes of glass in the windows of the World Trade Center. And of those, that's the largest piece. A small object, but it's very interesting. There was a Marriott Hotel at the World Trade Center site that was at the base of the North Tower. This small card, which is a key card that you would use to get in and out of a room, is the only thing we saw in 10 months that had this words. What destroyed the items so completely was the collapse of the 2 towers. You know, the towers went from 110 stories down to about 8 stories in compression and just engulfed the entire 16-acre site at World Trade Center. So if anything was in, under, or near them, for the most part, and oddly enough, we'd find some objects that survived these collapse, most of the material was just crushed beyond recognition. Firehouses in New York all have a rider's list, it's called, and it's a chalkboard in the house. We have the actual board upstairs in the collection. We photographed it to put in the gallery because chalk is very delicate on a blackboard. But what you see here is dated September 10th. This is the hours of the tour, and on the board are the men who signed in, both the men who lived and died. So Lieutenant Hagen was killed. Jack Butler was the chauffeur. Jack lived. Bayer died, his Staten Island guy. Billy Green lived. He got out of the North Tower and escaped. Firefighter Holohan died, and Billy Johnson died as well. So it's an incredible and very tangible record of this horrific day. These are the men that came in later in the day or who were off that day. So you can imagine, I think Siciliano had taken the day off and another man had taken his place. This is an image of the engine 6 pumper under the collapse of the North Tower. You can see the pedestrian bridge and you can see the hose in the truck. And we looked very carefully at this photograph to confirm these numbers to make sure it was the back of our truck, because you can see the hoses covering the 6. But it's incredibly important documentation of this truck at the moment of destruction. And so we now know exactly where it was and what it looked like when the tower was on it. We also have interviews with the firefighters of Engine 6 who were dispatched to it to crawl around it to look for remains to make sure none of their men were in or near the truck, which they weren't. This is a piece of steel from the North Towers, floors 71 through 74. This is within 10 floors of the impact of Flight 11 on the North Tower. And again, you can see the openings where the windows would have been and pieces of this metal strip that would have held the aluminum clad on the front of the building. Every piece of steel is marked so you know which building, which floor, and which side of the building it's on. So we researched that after we took in some steel. It actually has the chalk numbers 71-74 from the time of construction. It also has the number stamped inside the steel, which correlates with that. It's such, the steel is such powerful stuff. It's incredibly heavy, very strong, and the piece is bent like a paper clip or something, like it's just a weak thing. And this is bent, we're told, not so much from heat, but from pressure of the building just coming down. There's not a lot of sign of burn on it. You start to get this sense of scale of the towers and of the demolition, the destruction that happened. All of our artifacts come out of Fresh Kills, which was a recovery operation. We worked very closely with the FBI and the New York Police Department as they were searching the material for human remains, personal property, and evidence. Fresh Kills is a 175-acre of an enormous landfill that had been closed. That was New York City's landfill for many years. It's on the southwestern end of Staten Island. And they closed it off on the night of September 11th and began bringing the World Trade Center there by truck and barge, which they did over the next 10 months. They brought 1.8 million tons of material there, which was, they searched for human remains. At the end of the recovery operation, they found over 5,000 human remains, tens of thousands of pieces of personal property and jewelry and driver's licenses. Many of these things being the only things that families got, because about almost half of the people who were killed were never found. So it became as much of a humanitarian operation as it was a crime scene. It was declared a crime scene on September 12th. We had access to Ground Zero in late October of 2001. As a museum, we contacted the Port Authority, and the Port Authority owned and built and ran the World Trade Center. And so they were going in there to start thinking about, even at that early date, what kind of building fragments they would save if there was a memorial someday. So we went in late October to advise them about that, and frankly, we got into the site and we were so overwhelmed, we didn't have a lot of advice for them. It was still burning at that time. They were carrying bodies out the day we were there. I remember standing on what looked like an area of dirt, and I asked them where they brought all the dirt in, and they told me that it wasn't dirt, it was ground World Trade Center just packed down on an area with trucks going over, which held the remains of almost 3,000 people. It's something you still think about every day. I'm in a museum job. I'm not used to seeing this terrible thing of human remains, but what was interesting, and not comforting, but it was interesting, neither were the FBI or police. They would be blown away at the end of the day, because, as they would say, they never saw so many good people killed. They were used to going after bad guys. It was a horrific thing, and I don't think anybody gets used to it. They only found about 200 full corpses, full bodies in 10 months, and of over almost 2,800 people, roughly half were never found. In the beginning, they were just keeping, looking for the human remains and personal property and throwing away the things that were more neutral, that were of interest to us. By December, I was photographing more, and they were beginning to actually see and save things for the museum. So you can see, for instance, there's keys, We have about 200 keys, and each key is engraved a stamp that says the World Trade Center. These are elevator signs of, the 110 floors in the buildings and about 100 elevator systems. We found about 20 of those. That's it. And then oddly enough, some things like this little deputy floor warden button, that's a fragile paper button that shows a lot of distress and fire, survives. Fresh kills, by the way, kills means water in Dutch. In upstate New York, there's rivers are called kills, so it sounds bad, fresh kills, like it's a morbid thing, but it means fresh water in Dutch. We went to the landfill. We're escorted by the police to the top of this plateau, and we had expected to see fields of file cabinets and chairs and walls and objects of everyday life and people's belongings strewn around fields. And basically what we saw was 175 acres of mountains of completely unidentifiable material. My first day, the only thing I saw that I could recognize was a FedEx envelope. They had cadaver dogs there in the first weeks, and the dogs were so upset because there was so much human remain in the piles that actually couldn't even be seen, that they finally, after about 2 weeks, took them off the piles because it wasn't fruitful. They knew where their larger remain was in the field because they could see it, they could maybe smell it, and then sometimes there were seagulls coming in and that they had to deal with as well. And then they would take them to a morgue truck, and it would go to the city morgue every day. As tough as it was, they were finding human remains. They were beginning to see things we thought were historically significant, and we asked them to look for and think about saving objects of everyday life. Here you have a telephone. This is one telephone handset they found in 10 months and 1.8 million tons. That's it. That was the one they found. FBI agent came off the field and handed it to me because he was so thrilled that he found this thing. These are floppy disks from the year 2001. They're a little square plastic and metal floppy disk. What you're seeing is a stack of them melted together. And again, it came off the pile in brown debris, and they rubbed it off and knew what it was and saved it for us. This is a laptop. This is a computer. This is what's left of somebody's computer. We have no idea who's in that office. We asked them to save any object that had the image of the World Trade Center on it, or if it said the words World Trade Center, please save it. And these are small souvenirs that you might find in the gift shop at Windows of the World. We have no way to know if these were owned by individuals personally because they were found in these mountains and they don't have personal identifications on them. This is a little doll, and she's dressed like a fireman. So we thought that was an unusual thing to save. It was Election Day on September 11, 2001, and we found a van that had election campaign material from a number of candidates. And we thought that was important to save. I photographed the van, and before they recycled it, they emptied the belongings out and gave those to us. We saw hundreds of cell phones at the site. And we were told by the police and FBI when we first started going to New York and to Fresh Kills, and many weeks later they would still ring in the piles, and there was a policy that no one was to answer or touch a ringing phone because with people still trying to call loved ones in some cases, and they would describe this worst thing ever, these phones lighting up and ringing, beginning on the 11th, and even weeks later, it was a sort of desperate thing to call them. So we took some cell phones into our collection later on, and when the police couldn't identify here, and they were looking for cell phones from the hijackers, which they never found as well. This phone is particularly interesting. This is the phone that belonged to a guy named Dan Heldridge, who worked for Morgan Stanley. He worked in the South Tower, and when the building evacuated after the North Tower was struck, he evacuated about 30 employees. And remember, in the South Tower, they were telling people it was okay to go back. They didn't know they were going to get hit. He decided to get everybody out. He got down to street level, and he realized he had left his phone in his briefcase near the window. South Tower collapsed. This phone ended up on the roof of the Deutsche Bank next door. Some hour or two later, an FDNY firefighter was up on that roof looking for human remains and inspections, found the cell phone, picked it up, it worked, and he called his wife to tell her he was okay because his wife is hearing all these firefighters are dead. So he stuck it in, the firefighter then stuck it in his pocket, went through his day. Dan Heldridge, the guy who owned it, his wife was sure he was killed, and she didn't know it until he got home at the end of the day that he was alive. Some days later, he got a call. His wife got a call from the cell phone. They pulled the number off, and it was the FDNY calling him saying, "We've got your phone if you want it back." So the two men corresponded for about 8 years, and they were finally introduced a few years ago as we took the phone into our collection. Dan Heldridge from Morgan Stanley met the firefighter who saved his phone. So this is a good story. Many of the cell phone stories from that day are not good stories. This is one of about 75 pieces of the planes that we collected. They would find these on the field. This is a piece of fuselage, probably a wing section. And you can see this very telltale fireproofing, this yellow primer paint on the inside of plane parts in the field is often how they find them. This is a particularly important piece. This is a piece of what we call impact steel, meaning it was on the floors that were directly impacted by the aircraft when they hit the buildings. And this is probably a ceiling piece, I think, as they described it. This would be an overhead beam, and it has a piece of airplane embedded in it. And it's the only piece like this that we know of. And they found this out in the field with hundreds of pieces of steel as they were processing them. And it has what they call this honeycomb aluminum material that are part of the construction of airplane floors and walls that are actually embedded into this piece. So it's a very important thing, we think, that speaks to the exact moment of impact. It's interesting, many of these things have such a destroyed look, it almost looks like archaeology, and it's not. When you exhibit it, then within a year of the attacks, the pieces had somewhat more of a sacred nature to them than a flat historical nature where you're using material to tell stories, to tell history. It was people's touchstone to a horrific moment that they had lived through, whether they were there or thousands of miles away. But we knew that there were these people that were killed, and the pieces were just embedded in this sort of sacred nature. Over time, presumably, the sense of sacred would move to the historical. So we've had probably about 5 million people through the gallery since it opened. So now we're seeing young people who are coming through the gallery who weren't yet born. We're always thinking about how the story is being told to people to give them a greater understanding. If someone comes away with just a couple of things we would want them to know about the enormity of the attacks, that the story of September 11th is still with us. You hear it in the news every day. And not forget all these innocent people that were killed.